Ever wonder what God wants you to do with your money? Should I give it all away or save? What did the early church do with their money? In Dr. Pendergrass's book, Give It Away, Reflections on How Christians Use Money, you'll get 4 short, powerful lessons on what to do with money based on some key texts from the New Testament. This is a wonderful guide for study and reflection. It even comes with reflection questions that are perfect for small group discussions. Give It Away, Reflections on How Christians Use Money. Buy your copies today on Amazon.com.
Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. I want to pick back up to where I left off last time, which is kind of part 2, reflecting on some texts that I heard interpreted by a preacher a while back, and I thought it was worth reflecting on for you. He's talking about worship, and this next part he talks about, he talked a long time about being a servant leader, and he says worship is ultimately expressed as a servant leader. Worship is ultimately expressed as a servant leader. I have a few things to say about that. The concept of that expression, servant leader, is very popular in Christian academies. You might say seminaries or undergraduate. It's a very popular thing to say servant leader. And it's just very popular. Books and articles and essays, on and on and on. I remember reading and studying about this stuff all the time. And I made the same critique back then as I still do, which is this seems nonsensical to me. At no point in the entire Bible, at no point ever does Jesus or anyone in the early church, Moses, pick anybody you want, there is no reference to servant leader in the Bible. I don't think there's any servant leader referenced even in the other canons of Scripture, in Orthodox and Roman Catholic. I don't think there is anywhere. Concept of servant leadership, it just makes, I think what they're trying to join together is Mark 10:45, and of course in John 13, that Jesus, I've not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And so the idea is that we serve like Jesus served. That's what it means to be a leader. But the text doesn't say be a leader. Jesus says if you want to be the first, you must be the last. Okay, but that doesn't mean they're leaders. This is not about how to be a leader and how to help a group of people accomplish a vision and be strategic and make goals. I find it very unpersuasive. There's not a lick of evidence. There is zero evidence of servant leadership anywhere in the Bible at all. That expression is not found. Now, if you want to pick together multiple different texts and say this is the concept, you can, and I've read those kind of articles before. But then what I do is I look up every single reference in context and go, that's not the point. That's not the point. That's not the point. It just isn't. At no point does Jesus say, here's how to be a good leader. He doesn't. Jesus doesn't talk about leadership. And I've read essays and books on Jesus and leadership and how he's the best model of how to be a leader. Well, you might be. Not to be sacrilegious, but what if Jesus wasn't the best leader? What if he wasn't the best chef or the best mathematician? What difference does that make? Why does he, anyway, maybe he was a fantastic leader. I don't know. But in my view, I don't think we have enough data to come to that conclusion of leadership skills. Now, I think there are nuggets we might draw from them, but in general, I don't think the Gospels are trying to portray Jesus as a fantastic leader. And one thing it doesn't at all draw is how to be a servant leader. I don't know what that means. And when they do try to explain it, I don't know what that means. So I'm just telling you off the bat, those are my views of that. It makes no sense to me at all. Moreover, it's illogical. It's just illogical. Leaders aren't good leaders because they serve people. That just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. You can be a fantastic leader of organization and set a clear vision and your strategy how to get there. You can coach your people. You can encourage them and never serve them. You could be you can accomplish every single goal you wanted to accomplish with a group of people. And the group of people do a survey. Did that CEO or that leader ever serve you? And they're going to say, no, never. They never served me. So they must be wretched leaders. No, they were fantastic leaders. We got everything we wanted to accomplish accomplished. And we felt like a team. We were in there together. But they never served you? No, never served you. This doesn't make any sense. You don't have to serve. It doesn't make any sense. If the point is you're trying to lead people by example, by serving them, great. That's when it's necessary to be a servant. That's the only time. That is to say, if the vision is, I want to lead this group of people on how to be a good server, so I will serve them, well, great. Okay. But that's a very specific, idiosyncratic rare instance where you're trying to lead a group of people how to be servants to other people. It just doesn't. In working at a restaurant, I want you to be a good waiter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait on you. I want you to come and sit at the table. I'm going to take your order. I'm going to take good care of you. Now, you go do you likewise. So I serve them. I led them by being their servant, and I went on. So in that rare instance, I'm trying, but I don't do it all the time. I don't lead them by continually serving them at the table over and over and over and over and over. Then I'm just being a servant. I'm not being a leader. I'm just their slave or their worker. I don't know. Anyway, I'll get off of that. Okay, well, that's a common expression that I don't find persuasive in any way you shake it, except maybe my analogy I gave in some rare instances, maybe. But it's not biblical. Then the text he gives is Luke 4:8. The text he gives for this point that worship is ultimately expressed as a servant leader is Luke 4:8. In Luke 4:8, Jesus is talking, he's talking to the devil. In Luke's version, it's the devil. This is a temptation narrative where he's cast out into the desert, the wilderness, and the devil's saying all these things. If you worship, bow down to me. He literally says that in verse 7. If you will worship me, if you will, and of course, remember I said this in the first podcast, proskuneo means to bow down. So literally is, if you will bow down to me, if you will prostrate yourself to me, all this realm will be yours. And Jesus says, it is written, you are to worship the Lord your God and serve him alone. Now, Jesus, of course, is quoting Deuteronomy 6:13. Deuteronomy 6:13. We are, in fact, to worship the Lord, or to show devotion toward, or prostrate yourself toward the Lord God and serve him alone. And that's it. Now, that's true, and that's good, and that's right. It's just that Luke 4:8 has nothing to do with being a servant leader, and has nothing to do with worship being a sign of servant leadership. And I think, trying to the benefit of the doubt, I think what he thought was, because it has the word serve him only, it must be aspect of servant leadership. Let me say it one more time. I think because he read the English word serve, you are to worship the Lord your God and serve him only, he thought this was servant leadership. But see, this is where just looking at basic words in a good Hebrew lexicon or a Greek lexicon will help you. These are synonymous. And I'd said that in part 1. There are two main ways worship is understood all through the Bible. One is to bow down or prostrate. Proskuneo means to bow down or worship. And the other way, the Hebrew likes to use it this way the most, and that is to serve. So in Deuteronomy 6:13, when it says to bow down toward the Lord and to serve him only, those are synonymous. It means the same thing. It means the same thing. This is not about being a servant to other human beings. This isn't about being a servant leader. It's not about being a servant to royalty or whatever. This is about showing utter devotion to God alone. So again, it's just this text has nothing to do with anything that he made it try to make a point. Nothing at all. Just nothing. The point is, Jesus' point and the temptation is, I don't bow down to you, devil. You don't get my service. I don't show my devotion or loyalty to you. I only give it to the Father, to Lord God. That's it. That's a very good, powerful, wonderful point. It's just not the point of Luke 4:8 and any stretch of the imagination. Okay, well, then the next section is a long exegesis, kind of Isaiah chapter 6. Now, in Isaiah chapter 6, we have what he calls his favorite text to talk about worship, and when everything's about worship, he goes to Isaiah 6. Which right off the bat, maybe, I don't know why that'd be the case, but here we go, Isaiah chapter 6. Now, Isaiah chapter 6, we have, for most people, this is a well-known passage about Isaiah's commissioning. This is what this passage is all about. In Isaiah chapter 6, we already had what we call chapters, 5 chapters, where Isaiah, 8th century BC prophet, is talking about, basically, in an essence, the Israelites need to repent. It's not good. They need to change their ways, or they're going to be kicked into exile. And in this section of the sermon, he moves on to say Isaiah 6 is like the very best place to go to learn about worship, which is fascinating for multiple reasons. One is because this text has nothing whatsoever to do with worship. It has nothing to do with worship. Worship is never mentioned. The word worship or to bow down or to serve God is never used, ever. Moreover, the text is not about worship, it's about a commissioning of Isaiah before he gives his next message. It's a way of saying, here's how Isaiah got his message, and here's why it's authoritative. Now, that is exactly what it's about. I mean, this is almost unanimous amongst Old Testament specialists. This is what's going on here. This is not a worship scene. And I'll tell you in a little bit, well, it's just not. So the first point the pastor makes is this one. God will use whatever it takes to get you to worship him. God will use whatever it takes to get you to worship him. Now, right off the bat, it makes me nervous because God will use whatever it takes to get you. I don't find that in the Bible anywhere that God gets us to worship him as if we are forced to do it, as if God is on a mission to make sure we bow down to him. I don't find that anywhere in the text. I just don't find it in the text that God makes us worship. God makes us bow down. God makes us serve. Does God want it? Yes, he does. And God has every right to do that. He has every right as the creator of the universe and judge and moral, perfect being that the Father, Son, and Spirit is, to demand that. Absolutely. I mean, just absolutely. It's perfectly logical. My wife, by analogy, she has every right to demand that I have devotion toward her alone and that I don't sleep around with other women. In the office of wife, she has the completely, perfectly logical and moral demands to say, you cannot sleep around. I'm in the office of wife. It's completely appropriate. Well, God, as the creator of the universe and judge and perfect being that he is, has every right to demand worship, devotion to him alone. He's in the office of God. That's just, yep. But he doesn't get me to do it. He doesn't make me do it. Now, there are three different passages he cites to make this point. Isaiah 6:1, and this is what Isaiah 6:1 says. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the sovereign master or Lord seated on a high, elevated throne. The hem of his robe filled the temple. That's it. So right off the bat, I know this verse has nothing to do with God using whatever it takes for me to, I guess you would say is he saw a vision, and that's what caused Isaiah to worship, but that's not what happens. He doesn't. Anyway, that's my view. You might find it very different. That's fine. That's not... Okay. And then Exodus 3:3-4, and Exodus 3:3-4, which I've already alluded to before, that's when Moses, God shows up in a burning bush, is not being consumed. And then he cites John 20:27-28. John 20 is when Thomas tells Jesus, he tells the disciples, I'll believe if I see him, and Jesus shows up and says, come touch my side, and you'll see these wounds. You'll see Thomas said it is I'm the one who did it. So he gives them signs. But in John 20, no one's worshiping Jesus. No one worships Jesus. And Exodus, anyway, the point is these texts just do not make the point at all that God will use whatever it takes to get us to worship him. God doesn't make us do it, and God's not desperate. Like he's going to beat us over the head until it happens or keep showing us a bunch of miracles. That's just not true. I've met atheists and they'll say, I believe them. They've never experienced a religious experience in their entire lives. Now, maybe they'll die. Maybe they won't die that way, but maybe on their deathbed. But it just seems to me there's going to be plenty of people who die and say, God didn't use whatever it took to worship him. He didn't, because he could do whatever he wanted. He really could make an angel appear to every single human being on the world and speak their language and say, I'm an angel of the Lord, and God exists, and you must worship him, or you'll go to hell. I mean, he could threaten people. He could beat them up. He could do all kinds of stuff. I mean, that's not the God we serve. It's not the God who's real. But so God doesn't use whatever it takes. Yeah, that's it. The next point he makes is authentic worship always results in a higher view of God. So it's the next point. It always results in a higher view of God. But off the bat is, I don't know what that means, to have a higher view of God. If you view God at all, appropriately biblically, you view it as God. You can't get a higher view of God if you're viewing him correctly. There he alludes to, of course, Isaiah 6:1 once again, Revelation 1:12-18, Exodus 3:4-5. I'm not going to those issues right now because I'm not going to. Here, I want to say a few things about that. One is, in Isaiah 6:1, he alludes to the higher view. It probably means to what he says in 6:1, which is that the sovereign master or Lord is seated on a high elevated throne. He's seated on a high elevated throne. Now, if you look carefully, and Richard Bauckham helped me see this. He's a New Testament scholar, but he's outstanding. He helped me see this correctly. If you look at the text carefully, it's very common when a Jew wants to distinguish how God is different from humans, they give them spatial designations, spatial differences, so that God is up high. In fact, he's not just high, he's at the highest. He's in the highest realms. It's a spatial distance. And so the throne is up high. The angels or the throne room is up high. You'll see this very often throughout the Old and New Testament. And he's right. If you look it up, he's right. So it's not, this is where the preacher is getting confused with metaphor and literal. When it says that authentic worship results in a higher view of God, it doesn't mean that literally when we start worshiping, God looks farther away. Oh, he's not up there. Oh, he's up. Oh, he's up even farther than I thought he was. He's not literally higher. And even metaphorically, he can't be higher because he's still God. I think he's just confusing the concept of a high elevated throne. That doesn't mean God literally is up high. It's a way to distinguish he's way, way, way above us. Of course, you might say he's literally above us. That's fine. Though most interpreters, I'm one of them, would say the point is not that he's literally high above us, but he's very different than. He's very different than. He's up, away from us. We say that in common American English when we say someone is out of our league. They're way above me, and so forth. And in this section, he also talked very quickly in the sermon. He dropped down to verse 6:8. And that's when it says, I heard the voice of the sovereign Lord or Master say, whom shall I send? Who will go on our behalf? Who will go on our behalf? And then verse 13, this is standard interpretation amongst people in the church. I hate to say this in a negative way, but a very conservative view. And I'm a conservative myself. I am. I'm a conservative Christian, evangelical Christian. It's just that there are standard, quote unquote, conservative things conservatives say that I do not find persuasive at all. And this is one of them. It's very common, and it's a churchy answer to say that whenever you see our behalf, it means Trinity. And people oftentimes go to Genesis 1:26, and it says, let us make man in our image. Let us make man. Virtually no one in Old Testament scholarship around the globe agrees. No one does. And I'm one of them. No ancient Jew would have understood the concept of Trinity. No ancient Jew believed in the Father, Son, and Spirit. And if they did, they never said it ever in any text that we have ever found. So if they did believe it, they did a good job of keeping it a secret. Or, it's more likely, they never believed in a Trinity. The Trinity was something revealed over time. So, David, what in the world is the us on our behalf? Well, the standard scholarly answer, the one I find by far the most persuasive, is it refers to the Lord, and of course the seraphs who are there. That's in verse 2, which I'll talk about them in a little while. Seraph, what is a seraph? And the rest of the heavenly assembly. We don't like to think about this in Christianity much, but the biblical authors sure have no problem with it. In the Old Testament, and somewhat in the New Testament, it is very common for it to say the Lord of hosts or the Lord and his council. If you're an ancient Near Eastern person, you don't think of a monarch on a throne ruling alone. Everybody thought of a monarch, a king, ruling with an assembly. The analogy I always give is like a president having the council or chief of staff and all their council. And that's exactly how it's mentioned many, many times in the Old Testament. All through the Psalms, Genesis, through Isaiah, through the prophets. In Job, you have Ha-Satan, the accusing one. His name is not Satan. It's not a name. It's just the job title. He's part of the divine council. Divine council. Now, what's interesting is, in the Old Testament, though God has a divine council, though God does have a divine council, we don't have references of God going to the divine council for advice. Now that's very weird, because in the ancient Near East, they did talk about the gods going to the council, and they have meetings, and they on, and then come to conclusions. The gods get together. It's a pantheon. But Jews never did that. They kept the idea that God is the chief monarch and that he has a divine council and an army, sometimes translated the Lord of Hosts. But what we don't have is evidence that God consulted his council before he made a decision. So that's what's going on. Whom will I send? Who will go on our behalf? That's all he means. He doesn't mean the Father, Son, and Spirit. He means me and all these other heavenly council that's here together. Who's going to go? But again, at no point that I know of in the Old Testament is God a teammate or co-equal with this divine council. No. He's always, quote, above them. He's always distinct from them, but there is always this illusion. Now, that illusion of a divine council diminishes by the time we get the New Testament. And then instead, we have much more emphasis that it's God the Father and Son and Spirit, like we read Revelation. Though there's some degree of a council there, and that's a different podcast. But they want to emphasize that it's the Lamb in Revelation, that's Jesus. He shares the throne. So they de-emphasize the role of the council. But in the Old Testament, it's everywhere. So that is not the issue of Trinity. His next point is that authentic worship means that it demonstrates that we're humble, and he described it. He gives multiple verses about getting all of our heart and mind, all of us, which is fine. But there goes to verse 2. In verse 2, I'll just stay in Isaiah for a second. Isaiah 6:2. Seraphs stood over him. Each one had 6 wings. Each one. Now the word seraph literally means a burning one, someone who's on a burn like on fire. Now, it suggests that these burning creatures might have had a fiery appearance. That's possible. Other parts in the Old Testament, like in Numbers 21:6, Deuteronomy 8:15, and in Isaiah 14:29, 30 verse 6, that same word refers to poisonous snakes. Now, the burning one, to be burning, could be a metaphor, because the idea is that when you get bit by a venomous snake, the venom feels like it's burning. So that's certainly possible. But moreover, when you look up that term in the ancient Near East and you see images, there are images of serpentine, snake-like figures around the gods of other foreign gods. So seraphs are these serpentine creatures that they're over him. These are gigantic creatures, and they have 6 wings. Now, again, literally do they have wings, or is it a metaphor? Whatever, say they have wings, that's fine. What they are not are angels. Again, this, and he and everybody says this all the time. Preachers say this all. They're angels. They're not angels. Angel, for the Greek word angelos, means messenger. Angel is a job description. These are spiritual beings. They are not angels. Now, how do I know that? Because you can read the Bible and look up every single time a spiritual being gives a message and see if it's a seraph. It's not. A seraph, like the cherubim, seraphim and cherubim, that's the plural and plural, or seraph and cherub, these are not angels because they never give a message to anybody. They're these spiritual beings, and what they seem to have the role of is something like a guardian. But in the Bible, they're not given much description of what their job actually is. But in the ancient Near East, when you see other images, it is something more like a guardian of the gods. So it could be some kind of thing about that going on. It's just the text doesn't tell us a whole lot. It just doesn't, so we can make up things. But these are these kind of fiery beings. They're doing something. But whatever it is, they're near the sovereign Lord, and they have 6 wings. Okay, so they're not angels. They're more like guardians. They're burning ones. They're not. Well, let me go on. Okay, here's what it says. With 2 wings they cover their faces. With 2 they cover their feet. And they use the remaining 2 to fly. Okay, that's what they're doing. So 2 to cover their faces, 2 to cover their feet, and 2 remaining to fly. What he said is they're worshiping. Well, nothing in the text says they're worshiping. And he says that they cover their faces because they're humble. This is what the preacher said. They cover their faces because they're humble. They cover their feet because their feet are dirty. and they've been walking around different places and there's dirt. And the other two, they fly around because they're obedient. They're obedient to God. So that's what worship is all about. When we worship God, apparently he's saying we're humble like these seraphs, and we cover up our dirty parts, the dirty parts of our lives. It's a metaphor all of a sudden. And we are obedient to God. That's what it means to worship. Now, my response is maybe. On the other hand, maybe. But everything else in me says that makes no sense. That's not what's going on. The seraphs are not here worshiping God, and that's not what's going on. They cover their face. If you read this in the ancient Near East, and you read in all the context now, and all through the Old Testament, rather, what they're doing is they're covering their face before God because he is God. It's not a sign of humility. You might say it's, okay, kind of, sort of, okay. It's the appropriate thing you do when you are in the presence of God. They cover it. Look up every time a human being or a spiritual being is in front of God, they don't look face to face. They cannot look face to face because they're not worthy to look face to face. They have to cover their face. So they're facing God, but they're not worthy to look at God. So they cover their face. Why are they covering their feet? Well, they might be literally covering their feet, meaning like pointing to the feet, but almost, the standard scholarly interpretation is feet doesn't mean feet. It means genitalia, or at least the region of genitalia. And why is that? Because when you look in the Old Testament, very often feet is an idiom. It is a euphemism for penis. Sometimes for females, typically penis. So if a woman lays at the dude's feet, it doesn't mean she's looking at his toes. It means she's laying down near his penis. So there's probably some sex involved. So to cover their feet is a way of saying that. Now, you might say that's kind of weird. Well, it is weird. But think about the time how people don't want to say the word sex or genitalia. They would never say penis. My father-in-law, when he grew up, and he's 82, 83 years old. When he grew up, they didn't say the word pregnant. They would say she is with family. Like, to even say the word pregnant was shameful in proper company. To say the word pregnant. Well, now we've got basically naked women on every commercial talking about everything. PMS and whatever. But in this time period, that was my point is, it just depends on the culture and the time period. They don't say the word genitalia, they say feet. They're covering their feet because that's what you do. It's a sign, again, that they're too shameful, as it were. They're not to see that part, because from the genitalia comes, for the Jew, in a Jewish worldview, comes things that can make you ritually impure, like urine, or even defecation, of course, from the anus and so forth, and they cover them. Or semen can come out. And those areas in Judaism of the body can render you ritually impure. It doesn't mean you're a sinner, it just means you're ritually impure. And that's why people, before they go to battle in the Old Testament, they're not supposed to have sex with their wives. They're supposed to be ritually pure. So they cover their faces, they cover their genitalia, or that area. Does that mean these seraphs had penises? The text doesn't say. It doesn't say. They have something that renders some kind of genitalia area, but if I'm a Jew and I hear that, I go, of course they're doing that. They're in the presence of God. That's what I would do if I'm in the presence of God. And the last two remaining to fly, meaning they're just in front of the throne. Now, it could be to fly around for God, but that's not what the text says. The odds are fairly high. They're flying, that is, flying up super high. Remember the metaphor, the image, that there's a high, elevated throne. They didn't climb a ladder to get up there. They have to get up there somehow, where they're flying. The image is that these seraphs, these serpentine figures with wings, are flying around the throne, way up high, in one spot, like a hummingbird, bzzz, or a bee that's in one spot. They're in front of him, but they can't see him, and they're too ashamed to do that. And they say something to each other. So I disagree with everything he said, the pastor said, about what's going on here. So the seraphs are not doing, they're not doing, I think, anything he said. They call, verse 3, moreover, they call out to one another. They call out, so they talk to each other, and they say exactly what any Jew would have thought of the scenario. They say to one another about God, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord who commands armies. His majestic splendor fills the entire earth." Holy, holy, holy is the Lord who commands armies. He's not saying holy, holy, holy because he's looking at the Father, Son, and Spirit. You're holy, you're holy, you're holy. But many preachers say that. If that's what you want to believe, I guess you can. The text doesn't say that, nor does it imply it. When you look up the way ancient people, including Jews, use numbers in series, they use 3. It was a way of something was whole or complete, like they did the number 7. And that's what's going on. Holy, holy, holy means he is completely, perfectly holy. And he commands all the armies. What armies? Well, the heavenly armies, like the Lord of hosts. That's that old King Jimmy way of saying it. But you can say that, or you can mean that his divine assembly. He commands them. His majestic splendor fills the entire earth. That is literally means his sovereignty, his glory, his brightness. It fills the entire earth. He's that big. He's that glorious. So they're saying to one another what is fact. He, in fact, is holy. They are not praising God. They're not thanking him for something he's done. These seraphs are not showing gratitude. They're not serving his will right now. They're not bowing down prostrate. They are it doesn't say what role they're playing, but again, if you use ancient Near Eastern context, they're acting somewhat like a guardian probably, but we're not sure. And they're saying to one another what every single Jew would have thought. That is, God is holy. Now, who gives a rip about that? And the preacher never defined the term ever, and that's another big problem. Holy is a little bit difficult to define because, well, it just is. And I've defined this on multiple podcasts. Holy means something like that attribute of God that is distinct from all of creation. That attribute of God that is distinct from all other creatures in creation. It's like, how do I describe something that's so special and other than? There's a word for it, kadosh in Hebrew, kadosh, or ayus in Greek. It's holy. So it's that feature which makes him separate than, and that's why oftentimes holy is defined as being separate than. Well, that works. It's more like being separate than as a feature of being holy. You are holy, which means you are separate than. You are other than. You're not. Holy means not creature, not of creation, and that's why it's difficult to define. It's God-kind. Only God-kind is holy. Humans have to be given a state of holiness when God confers that status. But you don't earn it. You don't earn God-likeness. God has to. Now, pots and pans and altars in the Old Testament can be called holy. Temples can be called holy. People groups can be called holy. Priests can be called holy. That's great. In the New Testament, Christians can be called holy. But it's a status conferred. It's like saying, God is saying, now you're with me. I am distilling out or spreading out my identity all over the earth, and now you're with me. And so that's why it matters how you behave. Holiness is not a moral attribute. It's a status of being different than creatures. So you don't earn holiness, you don't work up holiness. The reason why both ancient Jews and then, of course, Jews and Christians, the New Testament today, are to be behaved like they're holy, meaning because you have been identified as God, co-identified with God, you have to behave differently. But that's where it gets confusing, because holiness doesn't mean be good. Holy doesn't mean moral. It doesn't. And people always think holy is synonymous with being moral. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. It can imply, it leads to that, but it's not that. So, they're not praising God. At least that's my view. I don't see any reason at all to think they're not thanking God for anything he's done. They're not showing gratitude. They're not bowing down. They're not serving his needs. They're not being angels. They're not being humble. They're not being obedient. And they're not having dirty feet. Instead, what's happening is we have an image, a phenomenal image that fits very well in ancient Judaism. It fits very well. In Ezekiel 37, well, anyway, go through all the text you want, but this fits well of what ancient Jews thought. If you could have peeked back the heavenly realm and seen the highest realms of the heavenly realm, you would see God on a big fat throne, because that's how everybody in the ancient world thought about monarchs or kings. They sat on thrones, they would have had a divine council, and they had these otherworldly spiritual beings surrounding the throne, both guarding him and some spiritual beings doing what he wants, giving messages. We call them angels. And some different spiritual beings were not just guardians or messengers. They were warriors. They were fighters. They have different jobs. And this is what's going on here. So he has this image. Now, verse 4, the sound of their voices shook the door frames, and the temple was filled with smoke. Smoke is always used in the Bible for an image of God's presence. That's why in this temple's filled with smoke, because of course it is. He said, well, God's nearby. Well, about this temple. So there's a temple up there? Well, that's what Jews thought. For a long time, and they still pretty much argue today that there's a heavenly temple. A heavenly temple. Now, by the time we get the New Testament, there is no temple. We are the temple. And so there's a change in theology when we get to Revelation. But in the Old Testament, they did have this image that there's a heavenly copy. There's a heavenly Ark of the Covenant. There's a heavenly temple. There's a heavenly altar. All those things and they're perfect and pristine, and they're waiting on us. And that the earthly temple and earthly altar are just earthly forms of them, basically. And here's saying, and so forth. But that's why in verse 4, when they're saying that these seraphs are saying this thing, it shakes the temple. I mean, these are some gigantic, huge creatures saying what he is. Now, of course, this is why it sets up what happens in the text in Isaiah chapter 6, which is, of course, however bizarre it is to you and me, when Isaiah is picturing what's going on, he has a glimpse of this heavenly realm, and he is unworthy. He is unworthy. Of course he's unworthy. And what the text says is he needs to be, it's implied. It is implied. He needs to be ritually purified. So the way to get ritually purified is he has to have these beings come and give him coal. Now this is, it's weird to us, but in the ancient world, we have other texts where a person is made ritually pure to see what's going on. So in verse 5, he says, too bad for me, I'm destroyed. My lips are contaminated by sin. That my lips are contaminated by sin, it's a way of saying I'm ritually impure. I can't speak up. I can't see. I live among people whose lips are contaminated by sin. It means I, like my people, are unworthy to be in the presence of this, to see this vision. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord, Yahweh, who commands armies. But then one of the seraphs flew toward me. In his hand was a hot coal he had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth and said, look, this coal has touched your lips. Your evil is removed. Your sin is forgiven. And almost certainly what's going on here is now he is ritually pure, and now he can speak and respond to this vision. Again, that's weird to me, but that's exactly, and if you look up ancient context, you'll see other images and other people groups. This kind of stuff happened. The priest might put honey on their tongue, and now they're ritually pure to see the vision of the gods or whatever. But here it's coal that purifies it. And he says, now I'm ready to go. Verse 8, I heard the voice of the sovereign master, whom will I send? Who will go on our behalf? And I said, here am I, send me. You can picture Isaiah hopping up with his hand. He said, go and tell these people. And then he says on and on. Here's what you should say. So Isaiah sees a vision of a holy God with these beings saying that he is holy. Isaiah is stuck. He is sunk, going, now what in the world do I do? I'm not worthy to see this at all. Well, God makes a way. God says, I'll make you worthy to say something and do something. I'll fix it. I'll send this coal down and I'll purify your mouth. And now you can speak on my behalf of what you've seen. And that's what happens. So God fixes it. He fixes it. And Isaiah doesn't burst into song. He doesn't burst into worship. He doesn't start praising God. He doesn't worship. He doesn't praise and serve God's needs. Instead, what he does is he has a prophetic message. There you go. You might say, well, he serves God's will by giving a prophetic message. That's fine. That's fine. But he's not worshiping. So this text is nothing but worship. I'll say this last thing about all this because it's interesting, but one thing that's common amongst preachers, and it just is. He made a point, and I was going to bring it up earlier, but I want to save it to the very end because it's a very different kind of thing. He made a point about being a servant leader back in Luke chapter 4 and about worshiping and so forth. He goes to Luke chapter 24, verse 52. And in Luke 24:52, we have the very end of the gospel, very end, where Jesus is going up. He goes up into heaven as the ascension. And in verse 52, it says, so they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And it says, Jesus, therefore the disciples worshiped Jesus. The problem is they worshipped him. That expression, they worshipped him, isn't in a lot of ancient manuscripts. And that's why a lot of scholars don't think it's there. Instead, what it should say is they returned to Jerusalem with great joy. That there is no concept that they worshipped him. Now, maybe they did, but there are several really good manuscripts that don't have that. The point is, when you make a preaching point on a variant that probably wasn't there in the original, I find that problematic. I mean, it might be there, but it's problematic. I remember I heard a guy, a different pastor, preach a whole sermon on fasting, how important it is, and he used Matthew 17:21. And I remember he went there, I couldn't believe it. The problem is, you might guess it, there is no Matthew 17:21 in all the ancient manuscripts. There just isn't. And that's about fasting. He says you have little faith. This is one that comes down the mountain, and he says, we couldn't cast out these demons. And he says, why not? Jesus says he told them it was because of your little faith. I tell you the truth, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there. It will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Well, some manuscripts add, but this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. But no one thinks that's original. But this guy preached a whole sermon on a verse that no modern scholars for a long time have thought is actually original to the text. So this is very problematic, as usual, when we have preachers who, they don't know textual criticism, but even then, if you just look at a lot of good study Bibles, it will say in the notes, most ancient manuscripts don't include this. And that's very problematic to me. And the whole time I was frustrated, I can't believe he's not even going to mention the fact that this probably wasn't original. Now, if he's going to say it, at least say that. At least say, this is probably not original, but some scribes added this at some point, so I'm going to preach on it. Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, I wouldn't do that, but at least there it's honest and you're alluding, and otherwise you're making a whole point of these sermons, and no one in the audience knows that. Or, I mean, most people aren't specialists, but the guy preaching or the gal preaching should know that, should know the difference and say, I'm not going to make a whole sermon on fasting when it's not even the ancient text, or a whole sermon, whatever it is, but anyway, God bless you. I'm going to stop there, and I hope this has been helpful to understand Isaiah 6 and so forth. And I hope, and if not, God bless you anyway. See you soon. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. At Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it, and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, or at Glimpse the King, at Glimpse the King, and I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.